5 hours before sunrise on June 4, 1942, Captain Richard Fleming sits alone in the ready room on Midway Atoll. The building is dimly lit. Outside, mechanics move between aircraft under harsh floodlights, their shadows stretching across the coral airstrip. Inside, most of the pilots are trying to sleep. Fleming is not one of them. He sits at a wooden table with a worn manual open in front of him, studying carrier attack diagrams and dive-bombing profiles. A pencil moves across the margin as he adds another note to the page. Some of the other pilots call him Bookworm. Sometimes the nickname is affectionate. Sometimes it isn't. But in a few hours, that quiet obsession with preparation will help turn confusion into precision in one of the most important battles of the war. June 1942. The Pacific Ocean is no longer just an ocean. It is a battlefield measured in thousands of miles. The Japanese combined fleet is steaming toward Midway, hoping to lure what remains of the American carrier force into a trap and destroy it. If Midway falls, Hawaii becomes vulnerable. If Hawaii falls, the entire American position in the Pacific begins to collapse. Everyone on the island understands this. Midway itself is little more than a narrow strip of coral and sand surrounded by endless water. But strategically, it is everything. The airfield is already alive with activity. Marine ground crews move between aircraft with quiet efficiency. Floodlights illuminate rows of dive bombers as mechanics tighten panels, patch bullet holes, and check hydraulic lines one more time. Engines cough to life in the darkness, then settle into uneven idles. Fuel trucks move slowly along the taxiways. Bombs are lifted into place beneath aircraft wings. There is no shouting, no speeches, only preparation. The squadron stationed here, Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, known as VMSB 241, is not an elite force. It is a mixed unit. Some pilots are experienced. Many are not. Their aircraft are a mixture of two very different machines. The newer SBD Dauntless, a sturdy dive bomber capable of absorbing punishment, and the older SB-2U Vindicator, an aircraft already considered outdated before the war even began. The Vindicator is slow, underpowered, and dangerous in a dive. The pilots have nicknamed it the Wind Indicator. Some of them use worse names, but it can still carry a bomb, and that is enough, because those bombs will soon be dropped against the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. Richard Fleming is 24 years old. He grew up far from the ocean in St. Paul, Minnesota, a quiet Midwestern city where winter sometimes feels endless. His father worked in insurance. His mother was a schoolteacher. The household was stable, disciplined, and deeply religious. Fleming was the kind of student teachers liked. Quiet, methodical, curious. He finished assignments early and often read ahead in the textbook. Maps fascinated him. History fascinated him even more. His teachers noticed something unusual. He didn't just ask questions. He asked questions that suggested he had already considered several possible answers. In high school, Fleming played football. He was not a star player, but he was dependable. He showed up early, learned the playbook, executed his assignments exactly the way the coaches expected. He was the kind of player every team needed, even if he never scored the winning touchdown. When the yearbook committee asked what he planned to do after graduation, Fleming answered simply. He was thinking about joining the military. No one who knew him was surprised. He enrolled briefly at the University of Minnesota, but the world outside the classroom was changing too quickly. In 1939, Europe erupted into war. Germany invaded Poland. France would fall. Britain would stand alone. Fleming watched the news carefully and quietly made a decision. He left school and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. There was no dramatic farewell, no speeches, just a choice made by a young man who believed the world was heading towards something unavoidable. He wanted to be ready. Flight training at Pensacola suited him perfectly. Flying required precision, technical understanding, calm under pressure. Fleming approached it the same way he approached everything else, with careful study. He learned to fly the N-3N biplane trainer, then advanced to more complex aircraft. Navigation, meteorology, engine systems, dive bombing theory. He studied them all relentlessly. Instructors noticed something about him. He was not the most naturally gifted pilot in the class. Some men had better instinctive control of an airplane. But Fleming made fewer mistakes. He learned faster. And after the day's flying ended, he was still in the ready room reading manuals. By the time he earned his wings, Fleming had memorized an enormous amount of information. He could identify Japanese warships by silhouette. He knew the altitude ranges where anti-aircraft fire was most effective. He understood the mathematics of a bombing dive, how speed, angle, and release altitude determined accuracy. Other pilots sometimes teased him for studying so much, but they also understood something else. If things went wrong in the air, Fleming was exactly the kind of pilot you wanted nearby. In early 1942, he joined VMSB 241. The squadron was assembling for deployment to the Pacific. Its aircraft were a patchwork collection. Some pilots flew Dauntless dive bombers. Others flew the older Vindicators. Fleming trained in both. He learned their strengths. More importantly, he learned their weaknesses. The Vindicator could not outrun a Japanese Zero fighter. It could not outturn one either. If a Vindicator pilot allowed himself to be drawn into a dogfight, he would almost certainly die. Fleming understood this clearly, which meant the only solution was to avoid that situation entirely. He studied Japanese fighter tactics. He examined intelligence reports describing how Zero pilots coordinated their attacks. He spoke with combat veterans whenever possible. Slowly, he built a mental map of the enemy, not because he feared them, but because he respected the problem they represented. Some of his squadron mates admired his dedication. Others thought he was taking things too seriously. One pilot joked that Fleming probably dreamed in aircraft silhouettes. Another said he would rather fly beside Fleming than any hotshot pilot in the squadron. Fleming responded to neither comment. He simply kept studying. When VMSB 241 arrived at Midway in May 1942, the situation was already tense. Everyone knew the Japanese were coming. The only question was when. The Marines stationed on the island understood their role perfectly. They were the tripwire. If Japan intended to capture Midway, the first blows would fall here. And the first men to meet them would be the pilots preparing their fragile dive bombers under the floodlights of the airfield, including Captain Richard Fleming. The Japanese Navy had an advantage the Americans could not ignore. Their fighter pilots flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, one of the most agile aircraft in the world. It could outclimb and outturn almost anything the Americans had in the Pacific during 1942. And those fighters operated from 6 powerful fleet carriers, each one carrying dozens of aircraft and protected by experienced pilots who had already fought across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. They were professionals, and they were very good. The Americans facing them were still learning. Pearl Harbor had crippled much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The remaining carriers were overworked and constantly at sea, operating with crews that had little time to train for a battle of this scale. The Marines on Midway were flying aircraft that were already becoming outdated. Many of the pilots had never seen a Japanese carrier before. Some had never faced enemy fighters in combat. The doctrine looked solid on paper. But paper was not the sky. Dive bombing was supposed to be the equalizer. The idea was simple. Approach the enemy fleet from high altitude. Roll into a steep dive. Release the bomb close to the target for maximum accuracy. Then pull out and escape at speed before the enemy could respond. The SBD Dauntless was designed for exactly this mission. It had dive brakes to stabilize the aircraft during the plunge and a strong airframe that could survive the brutal pullout. The SB-2U Vindicator, the aircraft Fleming was flying, was another story. It was slower, weaker, and far less forgiving. Pulling out of a steep dive put enormous stress on the airframe. Doing it while enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns were firing at you made the maneuver almost suicidal. The Japanese fleet was also built for defense. Carrier groups traveled with layers of protection. Fighter patrols circled above the fleet at multiple altitudes, ready to intercept incoming attackers. Destroyers and cruisers surrounded the carriers in a protective ring. Their anti-aircraft guns could fill the sky with exploding shells. Any American dive bomber that survived the fighters would still have to dive through that wall of fire, release its bomb at the last possible moment, and then escape while enemy fighters chased it across the ocean. It was not a mission. It was a gauntlet. Richard Fleming understood the danger better than most. He had studied the reports from the Battle of the Coral Sea, where American dive bombers had attacked Japanese carriers only weeks earlier. The lessons were clear. The pilots who survived were the ones who remained disciplined. They trusted their training. They held their dive until the correct moment. They released their bombs exactly when they were supposed to. The pilots who died were often the ones who hesitated. The ones who pulled out too early, or the ones who lost track of the target in the chaos of battle. The difference between success and disaster was measured in seconds. Major Lofton Henderson, commander of VMSB 241, knew all of this. He was an experienced officer, calm and direct, and he knew the odds were against them. The squadron's orders were simple. Find the enemy carriers. Attack them. Inflict as much damage as possible. Nothing else mattered. This was not reconnaissance. This was not a demonstration. This was a fight for survival. When the message finally arrived on the morning of June 4th, the room became very quiet. Japanese carriers had been spotted northwest of Midway. Range and heading were confirmed. Launch every available aircraft. The pilots gathered quickly for a final briefing. Henderson did not give a dramatic speech. He simply reviewed the navigation, confirmed the attack plan, and reminded them to make every bomb count. No one needed inspiration. They already knew what was at stake. Fleming walked across the airfield toward his SBE-2U Vindicator. Mechanics were already finishing the final checks. He climbed into the cockpit, buckled his harness, and began his startup procedure. The Wright Cyclone engine coughed twice before roaring to life. The vibration of the aircraft traveled through the seat and into his chest. The familiar smell of fuel and oil filled the cockpit. Everything felt solid. Everything felt ready. As ready as it could be. The squadron launched in sections, climbing northwest toward the contact point. Below them, the Pacific stretched in every direction, a flat blue mirror reflecting the morning sun. The formation settled into position. Engines droned steadily. Radio chatter remained minimal. Everyone was conserving fuel and concentration. Fleming scanned the horizon continuously, checking for enemy fighters, checking his formation, checking compass heading and time. Always time and distance. Then someone spotted them. At first they appeared as dark shapes on the horizon. Then the shapes grew larger. Ships, dozens of them. And in the center, the unmistakable flat silhouette of an aircraft carrier. Fleming felt his pulse slow instead of quicken. This was the moment he had prepared for. Everything he had studied. Everything he had practiced. It would all be decided in the next few minutes. Major Henderson rolled his aircraft into the attack. The dauntless dive bombers followed, tipping forward into steep dives as their dive brakes deployed with a metallic howl. Fleming waited a moment longer. Then he pushed his Vindicator over the edge of the sky. The aircraft shuddered as the nose dropped. The airspeed climbed rapidly. The altimeter began unwinding. Below him, the Japanese carrier grew larger with terrifying speed. Anti-aircraft shells exploded all around him. Black bursts filled the sky. The Vindicator groaned under the pressure of the dive. But Fleming held the stick steady. 3,000 feet. 2,000. The carrier now filled the entire windscreen. He could see aircraft parked on the deck. He could see sailors running for cover. He could see gun crews aiming upward. And then, at the exact moment his training demanded, Fleming pulled the release lever. The aircraft jolted as the bomb dropped away. He hauled back on the stick with every ounce of strength he had. The Vindicator shuddered violently as it clawed its way out of the dive just above the waves. Behind him, the bomb fell toward the carrier. But Fleming never saw the impact. Because the Zeros were already coming. He was still alive. Richard Fleming turned his damaged aircraft southeast and began the long flight back toward Midway. The adrenaline of the attack was fading now, replaced by a heavy exhaustion and a cold, steady clarity. His hands were stiff on the controls. His breathing slowed as the noise of combat faded behind him. He had done what he came to do. He had rolled into the dive. He had held it through the flak. He had released his bomb exactly where training demanded. Whether it struck the carrier or splashed harmlessly into the ocean, he could not know. But he had stayed disciplined. And he had survived. That alone placed him among the fortunate. When Fleming returned to Midway, the airfield was chaos. Aircraft were scattered across the coral runway, some damaged, others hastily refueled, and some simply missing. Ground crews sprinted between planes carrying ammunition belts, fuel hoses, and tools. Pilots climbed down from cockpits pale, shaken, and exhausted, gulping water while trying to process what they had just experienced. Some aircraft limped in trailing smoke. Others never appeared on the horizon. Fleming taxied his Vindicator into its revetment and shut down the engine. When the propeller finally stopped spinning, the sudden silence felt almost unreal. He climbed down slowly. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands trembled as the tension left his body. But he was alive, and his aircraft had made it home. Not everyone had been that lucky. Major Lofton Henderson, the squadron commander who had led the first dive, did not return. Several other pilots were missing as well. The losses hit the squadron hard. But the battle itself was far from finished. Intelligence reports indicated that at least one Japanese carrier remained afloat. Another strike would be necessary. Fleming found a patch of shade beside a parked aircraft and sat down. From his flight bag, he pulled the small notebook he carried everywhere. Then he began writing. Altitude of the flak bursts. Enemy fighter patterns. Dive angle. Pull-out altitude. Aircraft performance during the attack. It looked almost clinical. But for Fleming, this was how survival worked. Every detail mattered, because there would almost certainly be a next mission. Later that afternoon, confirmation came. Another strike was being organized. This one would be smaller, more deliberate. Volunteers only. Fleming did not hesitate. He stood, walked to the operations tent, and reported in. His squadron mates watched him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. One pilot muttered, "You're crazy." Fleming didn't respond. He simply studied the map. June 5, 1942. Dawn had not yet broken when Fleming climbed back into another SB-2U Vindicator. The battle of the previous day had shattered much of the Japanese carrier force. But one carrier, damaged but still afloat, was believed to be limping away toward the northwest under heavy escort. Orders were simple. Find it. Finish it. This strike would be different. The previous day had been chaos. Aircraft from multiple squadrons converging from every direction, attacking simultaneously under heavy fire. Now the mission was surgical. A small group of dive bombers would approach carefully and deliver the final blow. If they succeeded, the crippled carrier would sink. If they failed, it might escape. Fleming personally inspected his aircraft before climbing aboard. Control surfaces, bomb shackles, fuel lines. Everything had to be perfect. Mechanical failure in the middle of the Pacific was a death sentence. The formation lifted into the early morning sky and turned northwest. The ocean beneath them was strangely quiet. Debris from the previous day's battle floated on the surface. Patches of oil spread across the water. The sea itself still carried the scars of war. Then someone spotted the ships. The carrier appeared first. She was damaged and listing slightly. Smoke drifted from her deck. Destroyers circled around her like guard dogs. Their guns were already pointed skyward, waiting. The Americans climbed to attack altitude. The formation split into sections. The first group would dive first, drawing the worst of the anti-aircraft fire. Fleming's section would follow seconds later. It was a calculated risk. The first wave would absorb the punishment. The second wave might get a cleaner shot. The first dive bombers rolled downward. Anti-aircraft shells burst across the sky. Black smoke blossomed around the attackers. Fleming watched the explosions, silently counting the seconds. Then his turn came. He pushed the Vindicator into the dive. The aircraft shuddered as it accelerated. The damaged carrier grew rapidly in his windscreen. He could see fires on the deck, gun crews moving, barrels tracking upward. Flak exploded around him. One burst snapped past his wing close enough that he felt the concussion through the cockpit. But he held the dive. The altimeter spun downward. The carrier filled his entire field of vision. Then, at the exact release point, he dropped the bomb. The aircraft lurched upward. Fleming pulled back hard on the stick, fighting the dive and dragging the heavy Vindicator back toward level flight. The engine roared. The airframe groaned. But the aircraft climbed. Behind him, another explosion erupted on the carrier's deck. Smoke rose higher into the sky. Fleming turned east, heading for Midway. But almost immediately something felt wrong. The controls were sluggish. The engine tone was uneven. He glanced down at the gauges. Oil pressure falling. Temperature rising. His aircraft had been hit. Fleming transmitted calmly over the radio. Engine damage. Losing power. Giving his position. Then he focused on flying. He adjusted the throttle, trying to squeeze every remaining bit of life out of the wounded engine. But the math was unforgiving. Distance to Midway. Rate of descent. Remaining power. The numbers didn't work. Minutes later, the engine coughed violently. Then it ceased. The propeller spun uselessly in the wind. The Vindicator became a silent glider. And Fleming was still 50 miles from Midway. He trimmed the aircraft for the best glide speed and aimed toward the horizon. The ocean rose slowly to meet him. He tightened his harness, reviewed the ditching procedure, held the wings level, held the speed steady. The Vindicator struck the water with a violent crash. The cockpit flooded instantly. Fleming unbuckled, forced the canopy open, and pulled himself free. The aircraft sank within seconds. He inflated his life vest and began floating alone in the Pacific. Hours passed. The sun climbed overhead. The ocean remained silent. Fleming conserved his energy and waited. Finally, late in the afternoon, the distant shape of a PBY Catalina flying boat appeared. It circled once, then descended onto the water. The crew pulled him aboard soaked, exhausted, but alive. The Battle of Midway ended in American victory, but the work of understanding it had only begun. Surviving pilots from Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 were questioned repeatedly in the days that followed. Intelligence officers wanted every detail. How had the Japanese carriers maneuvered? Where had their fighters appeared first? At what altitude had anti-aircraft fire been the heaviest? What tactics had worked, and what had nearly gotten the pilots killed? Among the material gathered during those debriefings were the small notebooks many pilots carried during the campaign. Richard Fleming's notebook stood out. It was filled with careful observations written in tight, methodical handwriting. Altitude bands, enemy fighter patterns, bomb release calculations, notes about how Japanese Zero pilots approached diving aircraft. Nothing dramatic, just precise information gathered under fire. Those notes began moving quietly through the Navy and Marine Corps training system. Fleming's observations about Zero tactics were incorporated into new training briefings. His calculations about dive angles and release points were refined and passed to other squadrons. And his insistence on discipline during the attack dive became something close to doctrine. Marine dive bomber pilots were told to stay calm, stay steady, and trust the numbers. The broader lesson of Midway was already reshaping American naval aviation. The battle had proven that dive bombers, properly coordinated and properly trained, could sink carriers. But it had also shown something else. Courage alone was not enough. The pilots who survived were not necessarily the most aggressive. They were the ones who stayed composed, the ones who trusted their training, the ones who executed the plan even while the sky around them exploded with flak. Fleming had embodied that principle perfectly, and even though he was no longer alive to see it, his example helped shape how marine aviation fought the rest of the war. As the conflict moved west across the Pacific, marine aviation grew stronger and more professional. Squadrons supporting the island-hopping campaign in the Solomon Islands began placing far greater emphasis on preparation. Pilots studied target folders before every mission. They memorized the silhouettes of enemy ships. They rehearsed attack profiles again and again until the sequence became instinct. The culture of marine aviation slowly shifted. Individual heroics mattered less. Collective precision mattered more. Fleming's quiet influence was part of that transformation. By the time the war reached places like Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, marine dive bombers and close air support squadrons had become extraordinarily effective. They flew thousands of missions. They attacked shipping, airfields, fortifications, and artillery positions with increasing accuracy. Bombing techniques improved, mission planning improved, and survival rates improved. Not because the war had become easier, but because American pilots had learned how to fight smarter. The lessons written in combat reports, many of them influenced by pilots like Fleming, were being passed from one generation of aviators to the next. Years later, historians would begin sorting through the archives of the Pacific War. Flight logs, after-action reports, witness statements, technical analysis. And among those documents appeared the quiet story of Captain Richard Fleming. He had never been a famous ace. He had not shot down dozens of aircraft. He had not lived long enough to write a memoir or speak about the war in public. But the records were there. The missions he flew, the notes he wrote, the discipline he displayed under fire. What emerges from those records is a different kind of heroism. Not the loud, cinematic heroism that fills movies, but the quieter kind that actually wins wars. Fleming was the officer who did his homework, the pilot who prepared until preparation became instinct, the man who understood that war was not solved by emotion but by clarity. He treated combat like a difficult engineering problem. Study the system, understand the variables, execute the solution, and do it under pressure. His Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously in 1942. The ceremony was quiet. His family received the medal on his behalf. His mother kept his uniform, his wings, and the notebook he had carried during the war. In his letters home, there was little talk of heroism. Mostly he wrote about the work, about the importance of doing things correctly, about making sure the job was done right. Today his name appears in many places. A.U.S. Navy Destroyer Escort was named in his honor. Scholarships have carried his name. Marine Corps aviation schools still teach his story to young pilots preparing for their own careers in the sky. But the most important part of his legacy is less visible. It exists in the culture of marine aviation itself. A culture that values preparation over bravado, precision over chaos, professionalism over spectacle. War stories often focus on the dramatic moments, the last stands, the desperate charges, the impossible victories. But wars are rarely decided by single moments. They are decided by thousands of disciplined actions repeated over and over again by people who understand what must be done. Richard Fleming understood that. He lived it. And in the end, he died doing it. The sky over Midway is quiet today. The wreckage from that battle has long since disappeared beneath the Pacific. The men who fought there are almost all gone. But the lesson remains. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear control your actions. Heroism is not about glory. It is about doing the right thing when the outcome is uncertain. Richard Fleming never chased fame. He chased results. And in a war where results meant ships sunk, missions completed, and lives protected, he delivered. They called him Bookworm. But in the end, his quiet discipline and relentless preparation helped turn chaos into victory. And that kind of heroism never truly disappears.